Okay, well, I guess we'll get started tonight. Welcome, everyone, to Alpha One Canada's drop-in meeting featuring Dr. Ron Gibson. As you probably already read, Ron is Clinical Associate Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of British Columbia. And unlike all the other experts we've had for our various events, Ron is no ordinary expert. He's also an alpha who knows firsthand what you're experiencing. I'd like first to get some of the technical details squared away, if you don't mind. As you may know, this is a Q&A session meant to accompany Dr. Gibson's video presentation that's on our website and on YouTube. If you haven't watched the video, you may be at a slight disadvantage, but I'm sure you'll catch on quickly. There are two ways to ask a question of Dr. Gibson. The first is by raising your hand. Now, we can't really see you, so in the control panel on your screen, you'll see a little button that looks like a hand. Click that, and I'll be informed that you want to ask a question, and I'll unmute your microphone and tell you when to begin. Obviously, to do this, you'll have to have a working microphone attached to your computer. The second way to ask a question is by typing it in the question pane, which is also in the GoToWebinar control panel. When you do that, I'll be able to see the question and I'll ask it of Ron. If you've chosen to telephone into the webinar, I'm afraid GoToMeeting or GoToWebinar provides no options for you to ask questions. Sorry about that, but just that function's just not there. We'll be recording this session and making it available to others on our website and on YouTube, so please keep that in mind when you're asking questions. Don't divulge any identifying information about yourself. Just a first name or even a made-up name is fine with us. When we're finished, you should receive a survey by email. Please take a few minutes to fill it in and tell us what you thought of the webinar, and also what other topics you'd like to hear about in upcoming webinars. This event, in fact, was the result of patient requests, and we'd love to be able to do more on topics of interest to patients and caregivers. So, without further ado, I'd like to turn the floor over to Dr. Gibson. Again, Dr. Gibson is Clinical Associate Professor in the Department of Psychiatry at the University of British Columbia here in Canada. Ron tells me he has a few opening remarks, and then we'll get into the questions. Ron?
Good evening. It's a pleasure to chat with you this evening, and I'd like to thank Jim Mundy and Alpha One Canada for giving me the opportunity. Before I forget, I'd also like to thank Duncan Lamb, who is our very patient and very expert background advisor to make all the technical things work. So I really appreciate all the help he's given me. I'll probably make reference to the webinar that I presented as part of the virtual summit in June. Let me apologize again for my voice in that presentation. I was just getting over a bout of laryngitis, which you will understand is a psychiatrist's worst nightmare. In that presentation, I mentioned sleep and how important it is for our health, both physical and mental. And I thought that I would give a brief overview of what's called sleep hygiene. And now that's a term that kind of may make you think of the YMCA in the 1950s, but it's really just a series of quite straightforward suggestions that have been well researched and scientifically proven to improve sleep. As a guide for sleep hygiene, I'll use the monogram that I mentioned in my talk. It's on the Anxiety BC website, and it's called Getting a Good Night's Sleep. So, I mean, when you think of it, it's a bit of a miracle that we fall asleep. I mean, one moment we're awake and conscious, and the next moment we're not. So psychologists have spent quite a bit of time researching how that actually happens. One of the foundations of sleep hygiene is to have a bed routine. And it's thought that each step in the routine, if it's washing your face and brushing your teeth and putting on your pajamas and turning off the light, each of these is a cue for the induction of sleep. And so, in fact, I think it's the case that the more cues you have, then the more likely sleep is to follow. You can add to this regime once you're in bed by taking 3 or 4 deep breaths or reviewing things in the day that have happened that you can be grateful for. Routine is important. Other strategies are to create a comfortable environment. So it's important that you have a supportive mattress, fresh, comfortable bedding, a good pillow. Also try to ensure that your room is not too hot or cold. Try to minimize noise and block out light. I mean, these are all fairly straightforward things. If you are noise sensitive, then you can try using soft earplugs. They're quite inexpensive, and I think you'll find that the first couple of nights maybe you notice them and they're a bit uncomfortable, but what surprises me is how easily people adapt to them, and that can be helpful. A third step is trying to consciously relax, and one can achieve that by breathing exercises, by meditation, or by progressive muscular relaxation. And on the slides from my webinar in June, I gave some references for progressive muscular relaxation. Obviously, being tired when you go to bed is a good thing, and so having some exercise during the day is helpful. Exercising for at least 30 minutes 3 times a week can improve your sleep. Some people find that having a snack, a light snack before you go to bed is helpful. What's suggested is eating light cheese and crackers or bananas. Turkey is mentioned, and a warm glass of milk, and avoiding heavy, spicy, or sugary foods. I mentioned establishing a routine. Establishing a fixed awakening time is also helpful. Most of us, if we're working, appreciate sleeping in on the weekends, but it's probably better for your sleep cycle to not do that too much. Another suggestion is sleep only when you're sleepy. Don't force yourself into bed at a particular time if you're not feeling sleepy. You'll just lie awake in bed and perhaps be frustrated that you can't sleep. Another recommendation is that the bed is used only for sleeping, not to watch TV or read or snack. Sex is the only exception to that guideline. And in particular, it's useful to avoid screens. What I read is that the current recommendation is not to view any screen for 2 hours prior to going to bed. You may think that cell phones are a small screen, but then when we're using them, we're holding them quite close to our face. Apparently screens emit a blue light or more light in the blue part of the spectrum, and that blue light is stimulating to the brain and makes it less likely that we'll get off to sleep. I'm informed that it's possible to get a blue filter for your screen or laptop, and I guess that would be better than looking at the screen without the filter. But in terms of decreasing stimulation, probably better to avoid screens if you can. If you can't fall asleep, after about 20 or 30 minutes, it's probably not going to happen then. And then the recommendation is to get out of bed and do something. And the recommendation from sleep psychologists is to do something somewhat aversive, things that you may not otherwise want to do. So what I've read is that you do any dishes that are left, you do the ironing, dusting. The idea is not to reinforce non-sleeping behavior with something that's positive. So for example, if people are having difficulty getting off to sleep, and then they get up and they read, and they read a good book or something that they really enjoy, then that's, in behavioral terms, that's a positive reinforcement for not sleeping. And so although it takes considerable discipline, a good idea would be to get up and not do something that you really like to do. Another suggestion is, in the guideline, is don't worry. Now that's very much easier said than done, but there's two techniques that might be helpful in that regard. For one of the anxiety disorders, part of the treatment is to set aside worry time. So from 9 to 10 in the morning, or whatever time you choose, that's your worry time. And you spend all of that time worrying. That has two benefits. One is that you have time set aside to focus on things that are troubling. The other is it's actually quite difficult to sit down and straight on worry for 30 minutes or 60 minutes. And after the first several sessions, some people find, well, most people find it actually really quite boring. So one idea is to set aside time for worrying that is not when you're trying to get to sleep. And if worries come up, to try to say to yourself, okay, I'll deal with that tomorrow. The other way of coping with worry as you're going to sleep is the smartphone app that I mentioned in my webinar called My Sleep Button. So again, that's My Sleep Button. You can download that from iTunes without any charge. So this is an app that simply asks you to imagine objects that are spoken on the program every 5 seconds. Actually, you can vary how quickly the items come up. So it'll be items like toothbrush, mustache, South America, hula hoop. I mean, absolutely random. And part of it is that if you're thinking of these items, then you're not thinking about problems that are worrying you. And you can set the timer for this for however long you wish. So it can be 5 minutes or 10 minutes or 15 minutes. And some people find that that's helpful. It has no side effects, it's free, so that's worth a try. Other suggestions are to avoid caffeine. It's interesting that the half-life of caffeine, the length of time that caffeine stays in your body, is actually much longer than people suppose. So it's something like 8 to 12 hours. So my general suggestion to people who are having problems initiating sleep is that they should not have any caffeine after 12 noon, and that they should confine their caffeine intake to 2 or 3 cups a day of coffee. Another suggestion is to avoid alcohol. So I think everyone's aware, if you have alcohol, it's a central nervous system depressant, and so people get drowsy. The problem with using alcohol as a hypnotic or as a chemical to help you get off to sleep is that its half-life is too short. So it's metabolized in 2 to 4 hours roughly. And then what happens is that there is an alerting response. That's why in movies people, even if they're drunk, wake up 3 or 4 hours later still drunk but alert. So avoiding alcohol before you go to bed is a good idea. It's probably not useful to nap during the day. I think the theory is that that may interfere with the mechanism of initiation of sleep. Some people can get away with so-called power naps of 10 to 15 minutes and still be able to get off to sleep at night. But generally speaking, long naps are not a good idea. Another suggestion is to get some natural light early in the day. And if that's part of exercise, that's even better. So those are suggestions for improving sleep that I hope will be of help to you. And so I'm very happy to try to answer any questions that people have this evening.
So I don't see any hands up, so I'll go first to one of the typed in questions. It says, for those of us who have been diagnosed but develop no symptoms yet, how do we cope with the waiting to see if symptoms do someday develop? Ron?
Well, that's an excellent question. I guess there's 2 approaches to it. One is that information can be helpful to you in guiding your behavior and the choices that you make. So doing things like certainly stopping smoking, avoiding dusty, smoky areas, doing things that would take care of your lungs are certainly a good idea. So on one hand, it's useful to use that information in making wise choices and looking after ourselves. On the other hand, it's not helpful to spend too much time worrying about what's going to happen in the future. So one way of doing that, a couple of things come to mind. One hears quite a bit these days about meditation or mindfulness practices. And mindfulness, as I understand it, has to do with being in the present, being in the here and now. To the extent that we worry about things in the future, if you start down that path, the amount of time that you spend in worrying about the future, by definition, is not time that you're in the present. The same as spending time worrying about what's happened in the past or going over events about which one might feel badly or guilty. As soon as you're doing that, you're also not in the present. So there's a book called The Power of Now, and the whole emphasis of that philosophy is to be present as much as one can. To develop a mindfulness practice or a meditative practice can help in this regard. So I went to a seminar, a conference recently where they were discussing the advantages or the benefits of meditation. And one is that it helps you practice focusing on the now. It was interesting because there was a couple of other proposed hypotheses for why meditation is helpful. One was that so you're sitting there trying to focus on your breathing, and your ear gets itchy, and if willpower, then I try to that. And the interesting thing is that very usually that goes away. So unpleasant sensations often, if you just kind of sit with them, they just disappear from our awareness. And so I guess the suggestion I would make is if thoughts about what happens in the future come up, to acknowledge, yes, that's a concern, and I should live my life informed by that information, but then allow it to pass and focus on something else. It's not an easy issue, and I certainly acknowledge that it can be a problem, but good question.
Okay, we've got a number of questions in the question box, but I see that Kimberly has her hand up. So Kimberly, I've unmuted your microphone. Please go ahead and ask Ron a question.
Hi, Ron. This is for my husband, Chris, who's beside me. He's got a couple of questions to ask you.
Sure, good.
Hello.
Hi there.
So I'm just wondering basically, why do I snap on people so quickly? I mean, I've talked to doctors about puffers that I've been taking, and we've been doing our best to remove the ones about steroids, but it just seems like on a whim, I just end up like snapping on people. And it's not like major crazy, it's just very snippy. You know what I mean? Like, not necessarily full-blown losing my temper, but it just seems like I can't deal with that particular second in time.
Well, that's a good question. That's a fairly common issue, so you're certainly not alone. If you're on steroids for your medication regime, that can sometimes make people a bit more irritable. Things to think about would be what your coffee intake is like, because if you're consuming significant amounts of caffeine, sometimes that can make people a bit edgy, and it makes you can make you alert, but it can also make you more tense. I guess if I found myself in that behaving in that way, then I would be inclined to kind of take a couple steps back, take a couple of deep breaths, and do a kind of internal inventory. Kind of ask myself, okay, so what's going on that I'm like this when I'm not usually like this? And that might give you some information about things that are bothering you, perhaps things that are issues that are present in your emotional life but haven't been discussed, that can certainly make any of us on edge and irritable. And if there are issues going on that we might not be fully aware of or acknowledging, those might be some approaches, because being chippy may get in the way of relationships. It's reasonable to say to your spouse or people around you, look, I'm just in a bad mood today. Ignore me. It's nothing personal. I'm just irritable and grumpy today.
Well, I do find myself being very anxious sometimes. I have slowed down my intake as far as coffee goes. But I mean, I was recently diagnosed last year. My father, who never drank, died more or less of cirrhosis of the liver, so we think he had alpha-1. I also have two brothers that have alpha-1. One has it in the liver, and the other one has it in the lungs, like myself.
Yeah, well, so you've got quite a bit on your plate in terms of concern for family members, but also worried about what might happen to you, and those are very reality-based concerns.
Yeah, another question. I don't want to take up everybody's time, but at the same time, why is it that Prolastin is only available in British Columbia, where in the Ontario region, it's not actually financed by the Canadian government or the Ontario province? I'm able to get it because I have benefits, but at the same time, I can't really retire from my job either, for the simple reason is I got a better way to spend a house, if you know what I mean, because it's a pretty expensive medicine.
It's extremely expensive.
Do you want me to take that one, Ron?
You might have more background on that. Thank you.
Sure. Prolastin is funded by actually 4 provincial governments: British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, and Quebec. Ontario used to fund Prolastin. They did it for 18 years, and in what can only be described as a cost-cutting measure, decided that the evidence wasn't there to prove that it worked, and while they grandfathered the people who were on Prolastin, they stopped approving new people. So yeah, we're in a situation now where if you live I guess easier to say, outside of British Columbia, Alberta, Manitoba, or Quebec, and don't have some kind of private coverage, then there's no way to get it. That's certainly at the top of Alpha-1 Canada's list of priorities, and I can't tell you, well, yes I can. We've made 6 submissions to the Ontario government already to try to get them to change their mind, including submissions written by Dr. Ken Chapman. We continue to fight the fight, and really it would appear to us that the only way we're going to change the Ontario government's mind is by embarrassing them into going back to funding Prolastin, and we'll continue to do that. In the meantime, unfortunately, there's a lot of people who aren't getting the medicine that they should, and I mean, it's not an excuse by any stretch of the imagination, but it's an explanation. Sorry.
Yeah, no, by all means, I get it and I understand it.
No, I know.
But
even, the other odd situation too is that the benefits plan that people who work for the Ontario government have covers it.
of course it does. Yeah.
So yeah, if you work for the Ontario government or happen to be an MPP, you don't have to worry. Now, interestingly, when even people in the public service, when they retire, their benefits are significantly reduced. And we've had a couple instances already this year of teachers who have retired and found that the benefit plan will no longer cover prolactin. And that's no doubt. I'm afraid that the idea of benefits for life went out quite a while ago. So I think unless you work for some of those people who still have them, like the auto companies or some of the other bigger companies, that's going to happen more and more. Is that yet as people retire, they're going to find that they have no way of financing their medicine.
Mm-hmm, mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I know it's hard if you don't have benefits, and now that you've been diagnosed, you can't get benefits. So that's also a catch-22. I mean, for myself, I've noticed that there has been a decrease in my being since being diagnosed. I notice I am way more shorter in breath. Flight of stairs can be troublesome sometimes. I'm constantly tired, not to the point of narcolepsy or anything, but at the same time, I mean, I'm very tired all the time, and I thought maybe that had something to do with the irritability and the mood swings and all that fun stuff, which could be the fact that alpha-1 being an air problem, breathing, it could be a lack of oxygen to the brain, and we all know why that's why we yawn in the first place. So, I mean, I was thinking it was all these different things. I don't think prolactin's doing anything for me. I do receive it once a week. But I know you're not supposed to feel differently. You're not supposed to, like, be able to go out and run a marathon or anything along those lines. It's only supposed to control it. But at the same time, I think I'm spinning my wheels with it for the simple reason is I feel like I'm getting worse. But at the same time, everybody else is saying, well, it's not going to make you better. So why give you a medication that's not going to make you better?
Well, because the medication slows you from getting worse. And that's, lots of patients have had significant benefits from that. I know people who've been on prolactin for 25 years and, are still, will swear by it. I mean, they'll tell me that had it not been for the prolactin, they wouldn't have lived as long as they have. So, you're right. It's not a cure. It's just a medication that's meant to slow the progression of the disease and help you to live longer and better.
And this is a genetic thing, so therefore it's in the blood. It's in your makeup. It's who you are. Also, at the same time, some people were saying lung transplants will help, but if everything is generated through the liver, and this is what's blocking the gene from getting to the lungs, because it's not filtering through the liver properly. Is it not a liver problem as opposed to a lung problem? It becomes a lung problem because it can't get through the liver. Am I right or am I wrong?
Yeah, I mean, we were hoping to talk about coping, but yeah, I mean, what we have here is a disorder that predisposes you to either liver disease or lung disease. Okay. And there's a lot of research going on in terms of curing the liver part of it, which then cures by extension cures the lung part of it. But you talked about lung transplants, and you're right. Once you get a lung transplant, you still have alpha-1, but in most cases, you've already got 40 or 50 years. First set of lungs, you're likely 40 or 50 out of that second set. So, I mean, lung transplants are certainly, in the right circumstances, prescribed by the physician and so on, are definitely lifesavers, and I know lots of people that have benefited from them. Anyway, thanks, Ron. And Ron.
I'm just doing my best to try and cope with it, so I've been informing myself, and at the same time, thank you guys very much for everything you guys are doing and all that fun stuff, and these are very great little seminars, I guess we could say, to open the lines of communication for this type of stuff, but also at the same time, I mean, you wanted to talk about coping. I don't want to take all your time, and at the same time, this is how I'm coping.
Okay, thanks, Ron.
Well, thank you very much for your question.
Okay, another written question. Any helpful tips to reduce consistent disturbed sleeping patterns?
First of all, they're very common. Something like 1 in 4 Canadians will have problems getting a sound sleep. Even though one might think because it's common it's not important, it is quite important. And it certainly warrants going to your family doctor and having a discussion with him about that. So there are many reasons why people have poor sleep, including quite a few distinct sleep disorders. So things like restless leg syndrome, obstructive sleep apnea. Not sleeping is a very kind of broad category and needs to be investigated, including having a sleep study. So that's where you would go to usually a university center and stay overnight, and they would hook you up with a heart monitor and pulse monitor and oxygen monitor, and with that they can diagnose particular sleep disorders. So it's if you're having a consistently disturbed sleep and it's not due to your bed partner, then that's worth going to your family doctor and talking to him about it and seeing whether there's an indication for having a sleep study done. And I would recommend and encourage you to do that.
Okay, we have another live question. This is from, God, there's an awful lot of Rons on the line tonight. This is from another Ron. So Ron, please go ahead.
Yes, I have had a problem with nerves and anxiety, and then I get into full-blown depression. And I wondered, on hearing your promo for this, is there anything I can do to avoid this?
Thank you for your question. Having high levels of anxiety is pretty common. It's certainly one of the most common psychiatric ailments, and it does predispose you to depression, to having trouble maintaining a buoyant mood. So there are a number of kind of general things that we can do, trying to get intact sleep and 7 to 8 hours, regular exercise, balanced diet. Something that there is reasonable evidence for is taking omega-3 fatty acids. At the University of British Columbia, in their mood disorder unit, where people are admitted from all over British Columbia, what I notice is that often, as well as standard psychiatric medications, folks are discharged on omega-3 fatty acids. So they must think that there's enough evidence that it's worthwhile, and I'm not aware of any bad side effects from it. So to take steps to deal with anxiety and get adequate treatment for it, I think is really worthwhile. And statistically, if you do that, you're then less likely to run into problems with maintaining a good mood. But it requires effort and thought and planning, and is certainly not easy. And I encourage you to enlist the help of professionals to get you to that place.
Along with that, excuse me, I did mention that I can't eat. I don't look forward to eating. I have no desire to even eat. And in the last 6 months, I've lost 40 pounds. And I still having a problem eating, and I even force myself to eat. But I just depression still hangs on there.
I'm very sorry to hear that. That's a real problem. If with that degree of weight loss, if you haven't already gone to your family doctor and asked for a referral to a psychiatrist, I'd urge you to do that, because that's a very significant amount of weight, and as a reflection of how much difficulty you're having.
Okay.
So this is a problem that needs treatment, or if you're already getting treatment, it needs someone to have another look at it and review your treatment regime, in my opinion.
Okay, we have another written question. I don't see any hands up right now. It's quite a few people on the line. Yeah, give it a shot. Put your hand up and ask live. Anyway, if people would like to seek help, where should they go? A hospital, social worker, psychologist, psychiatrist? Well, what would you recommend?
That's a very good question. Navigating the mental health system in any province is often not straightforward. The best place to start, I think, is with your family doctor. Now, quite a few people in BC and in Canada don't have a family doctor, and so then I think you have no option but to go to a walk-in clinic. The family doctor is trained to screen for emotional and psychological problems, and should be able to then refer you to the best place to get treatment. There are several options open to the family doctor. He can refer you to a psychiatrist. The problem, and one difference between a psychiatrist and a psychologist, is that the psychiatric services across Canada are covered under the provincial medical plans. A problem is simply getting to see a psychiatrist, because many of them have long waiting lists. So waiting lists of 2 to 10 months is not unusual. Another option that the GP has, the family doctor has, is to refer you to a psychologist. One can get in to see a psychologist in most Canadian cities fairly early, within a week or two. The problem is that one has to pay for that out of one's pocket, and the going rates are somewhere between $120 and $180 per hour. If you're employed in a company with medical benefits, then as part of those, usually there is services from a psychologist covered. Usually it's a dollar amount, so your one is covered for $500 or $1,000, or good plans will be maybe $1,500. So that represents only 3 or 6 or 8 sessions with a psychologist. The other difference between psychologists and psychiatrists is that psychiatrists are medical doctors, and so we can prescribe medication, and psychologists aren't able to do that. A third place where the family doctor might refer you is to a mental health clinic or to the outpatient department of a local hospital. A lot of hospitals have psychiatric departments, have psychiatric inpatient units, but they also have psychiatric outpatient units. And those are without charge, and usually one gets good treatment from them. All that I've described is a situation where there's no urgency involved, where people are not feeling well, they're having difficulty, but there's no threat to their life or anyone else's life. So, but sometimes things get worse, sometimes that happens rapidly, and people get to the point where they feel that life is not worth living, and they have the impulse or plan to do something about that. That's a different category. That's a life-threatening emergency, and at that point, you should go to the emergency department of your local hospital. Unless it's a small rural hospital, they will have a psychiatrist on call who would then come in and talk with you and try and find solutions to your problem. But it's often not an easy task to navigate through the mental health system. Other resources to help you do that are patient associations. So like the Alpha-1 Association, there is, I think in every province, a mood disorder association. Often they have a helpline. So these are manned by folks who know firsthand what you're going through, who've been there themselves. And so if you run into a roadblock getting the care you need, they can say, okay, well, where we live here, this is a good avenue, or these people are helpful. So I would encourage you to use patient support groups like the Mood Disorder Association, or I think most provinces have an Anxiety Disorders Association as well.
Okay, Ron, a little bit of a follow-up. Person wants to know whether a social worker would be able to help with navigating the healthcare system.
Very likely. It depends on what role the social worker has. So they may be knowledgeable about the resources and avenues for treatment in your area. So social workers in a hospital, for example, would certainly know those resources. There is. I'll backtrack a little bit to go back to the first part of my answer. So the family doctor could refer you to a psychiatrist, to a psychologist, to an outpatient department. He could also refer you to a private counselor. Those folks have a variety of backgrounds. Sometimes they're psychologists, but not with a PhD degree. Sometimes they're social workers. And it depends entirely on the therapist's training and experience, how good they are. Many are very good. They tend to charge less than psychologists, so they would charge in the range of $50 to $80 an hour. Some have particular expertise with people with cancer or people with chronic illness, like alphas, and some of them are extremely good. So that's another resource that you can access.
Oh, I just got another question. All right, I'll ask this one for, what about caregivers? How can we help the patients? The questioner wants to know.
I think both by learning about the disease, alpha-1 is, what chronic obstructive pulmonary disease is, and become knowledgeable about what your partner is facing is very helpful. Accompanying the partner, if they would like you to medical appointments is helpful. So what I've found useful is going with my spouse to medical appointments, and kind of two minds are better than one, 4 ears are better than two. Sometimes one of us will pick up on information that the other one just missed. It's very common to be quite anxious going to medical appointments. I'm reasonably anxious when I go to see my respirologist, and so to have someone else there to get information and also ask questions, I think is very useful. Beyond that, it's kind of a fine line. On one hand, one wants to be supportive of one's partner and encouraging that they have healthy habits and get enough exercise. That's on one hand. On the other hand, it's not helpful for your relationship or for the spouse if that person becomes reminds too much. Then there's a danger that you can become accused of being a nag. So that's a fine line to follow. I would encourage you to go to the Big Fat Reference Guide, which is online. So this is I don't know in a printed volume how many pages it would be, but it's a very extensive resource manual for alphas produced by AlphaNet in the United States. In my talk, I give the web link to it, and they have really a very lengthy and complete section on hints for partners and spouses. And probably will do a much better job than I can do about, as from memory, it poses a whole series of scenarios. If this happens and I'm the alpha's spouse, what should I do? So I suggest that you have a because I think you'll find it quite helpful.
Thank you very much, Ron. And thank you to everyone who took part and participated, like you said, especially Ron. I'd like to take this opportunity to encourage people to register on our website if you haven't already, and please encourage your affected relatives to do so. We often get asked by government people and other organizations, so just how many alphas are there in Canada and how many are liver affected and how many are lung affected, and we'd like to have as accurate information as we can. So if you take the time to just go to our website, almost every page has a button on it that says join us, click that button and fill in the form there. We'd really appreciate it. Now, finally, as I mentioned earlier, you should have received the survey, or you will receive the survey by email after this webinar is over. Please take the few minutes to fill it out and tell us what you thought of the webinar and what topics you would like to hear about in upcoming webinars. As I mentioned earlier, this particular topic was the result of a number of patient requests, and we'd love to be able to do more on topics that are of interest to patients and caregivers. So goodbye, everyone, and thank you for joining. If I could...
Non più tra i farfalloni amoroso, notte e giorno di torno girano, delle belle turbando al riposo, Narcisetto Adugino d'amor. Delle belle turbando al riposo, Narcisetto Adugino d'amor. Non più avrai questi bei panacchini, quel cappello leggero galante, quella chioma, quell'aria brillante, quel vermiglio d'onesco color, quel vermiglio d'onesco color. Non più avrai quei panacchini, quel cappello, quella chioma, quell'aria